Welcome the very impressive delegation from the United States Congress who is with us. We have 14 senators and 20 members of Congress who have joined our global forum this weekend. They're led by the senior senator from Rhode Island, Senator Claiborne Pell, who is the distinguished chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And we are very pleased and proud to have them with us. Senator Albert Gore from Tennessee has become recognized as one of the leading environmental legislators in our United States Congress. He is president of GLOBE, Global Legislators for a Balanced Environment. His thoughtful book on the need for sustainable environment and development politics has become a bestseller in our country. It is called Earth in the Balance, and I recommend it highly to all of you. He is a Democrat from Tennessee. He served 8 years in the United States House of Representatives before being elected to the Senate in 1984. He is a former candidate for President of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, for our keynote address this afternoon, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Senator Albert Gore.
Thank you very much, John Denver. Future progress is linked to improvement of the environment. We are seeing similar developments in the United States. Last week I was in Chattanooga in Tennessee, where there is a similar commitment to cleaning up the environment and taking a new approach to linking economic progress and environmental protection. I want to join with Deputy Lopez in saying a word of thanks to Akio Matsumura and all of the leaders of this global forum who have put together the Parliamentary Earth Summit. I believe that the Earth Summit, in its largest sense, is already a magnificent success simply because every nation in the world is thinking about the same challenge at the same time in a new way. But we parliamentarians have an obligation to use this success to accelerate the movement toward meaningful changes in policies in every nation on the face of this earth to stop the destruction of the global ecological system. This crisis will be discussed when heads of state meet here a few days from now. But long after the agreements arrived at in Rio are put in place, parliamentarians will be faced with the challenge of making the difficult decisions on how to implement this new way of thinking and the new shared conviction that we human beings must heal the relationship between our civilization and the ecological system of the earth. There have been a number of dramatic changes which have made it possible for this Earth Summit to take place at all. People all over the world now feel themselves to be part of a single global civilization. We are a community of separate nations, and we shall remain so. But we face the same problems, and we must construct a common agenda for solving those problems. The Earth Summit is the first of many conversations that will take place on a global basis as we endeavor to create that global agenda. There have been some remarkable agreements arrived at without anyone putting them down on paper already. Most of the world now agrees that freedom is a prerequisite for solving the global environmental crisis. And we parliamentarians must make a covenant with one another to struggle against the enemies of freedom. Dictatorship is an enemy of freedom. Communism is an enemy of freedom. Ignorance is an enemy of freedom. Corruption is an enemy of freedom. Racism and sexism, exploitation and oppression are enemies of freedom. And everywhere we look in the world today, wherever the human spirit is crushed, wherever individuals feel powerless and live out their lives in fear that they have no meaning or purpose, human beings and the environment suffer. From Eastern Europe and the states of the former Soviet Union to Ethiopia, to Tibet, to Haiti, to South Central Los Angeles, we have an obligation to hear what people are telling us as parliamentarians, to feel the suffering that Jim Grant tells us about when we hear the numbers about the children who are dying in the world every single day. We have an obligation to link the democracy movement and the environmental movement. We can do so as parliamentarians, and we must do so. Why then are spiritual leaders joining with parliamentarians in this dialogue here today? It is because so many of us have come to believe as human beings that the ecological crisis is fundamentally a spiritual crisis. It is not an accident that in those countries where the environment has been the most devastated, human suffering is usually the worst. Where the human spirit is pushed down and where hope has been abandoned, there is where we see the erosion of the soil and the cutting down of the forests and the poisoning of the water and the air. It is a spiritual crisis because the crisis springs out of the relationship between human beings and the ecological system of the earth. There have been three dramatic causes of this transformed relationship between human beings and God's earth. The first is the population explosion. After 10,000 generations of human beings, there were little more than 2 billion people on this earth in 1945. In the last 5 decades, the population has increased from a little over 2 billion to 5.5 billion. And in the next 5 decades, it will surely rise to at least 9 or 10 billion and perhaps more. We in the industrial countries must listen to those in developing countries who say, wait a minute, what about the fact that each and every individual in an industrial country is responsible on a per-person basis for 20 or 30 times as much pollution as an individual in each developing country? And we must understand that in order for the world as a whole to respond to the challenge posed by the population explosion, we must also address the problems of waste and wasteful consumption in the industrial world. And whether we are from industrial countries or from developing countries, we must listen when those who understand the population problem the best tell us that it is linked not merely to the availability of safe and effective birth control on a voluntary basis, but it is also profoundly linked to poverty and injustice and human suffering and child mortality, because as Julius Nyeri said 30 years ago, the most powerful contraceptive in the world is the confidence by parents that their children will survive. And so when we save the lives of children, we make it possible for mothers and fathers to choose to have smaller families. Let us also listen when these same experts tell us that the population problem is inextricably linked to the level of education and literacy in the world, especially among women who must be empowered to participate in the decisions on family size. Let us also listen to spiritual leaders from traditions which raise for them tremendous concerns about what we call birth control. And when a religious leader says aid for developing countries must not be conditioned upon policies related to birth control, we should all agree that aid should not be conditioned in such a way. And if religious leaders tell us without words that a change in thinking is possible, which allows some parts of society to address the question of making safe and effective birth control available voluntarily, while others, including religious leaders, will work on a continuing basis tirelessly to address child survival rates and literacy and education rates. Let us not prolong an argument which is ready to end without a victor or a loser in the language of argument. Let us simply move forward as a world with a new common understanding that we do have the capacity to create throughout this world the conditions that we know will lead to stabilizing population all over this world. Now, there is the second cause of this transformed relationship between civilization and the earth after population is the scientific and technological revolution. We have had a difficult time coming to grips with the fantastic new powers that have been given us as a result of our intellectual achievements as a civilization. You remember the story of the sorcerer's apprentice who learned a magical incantation which began a process which he did not know how to stop. We have been faced with a similar challenge. Just as nuclear weapons transformed the consequences of all-out warfare, so the thousands of new technologies which magnify our ability to exploit the earth have transformed the consequences of all-out exploitation. At the dawning of the nuclear age, Albert Einstein said everything has changed except our way of thinking. And over the last few decades, we human beings have tried to come to grips with a new way of thinking about warfare. We have not fully acknowledged the debt that all humankind owes to Brazil and Argentina and other nations in South America who had the courage to say, we will abandon this technology of nuclear weapons, and we will make a pact to stop the march that other nations began toward nuclear weaponry. We have had achievements in this area. Now we face the necessity of arriving at a new way of thinking about our relationship to the technologies for exploiting the earth. Chlorofluorocarbons, again, give us cause for hope because we parliamentarians have ratified agreements entered into among most nations of the world, which will now eventually result in the phasing out of chlorofluorocarbons. Let us build on that success by recognizing the partnership between North and South, industrial countries and developing countries, which made possible assistance from the North to those nations in the South which needed faster access to the new technologies which allow the quicker abandonment of chlorofluorocarbons. But of course, some of the technologies which are now contributing to the destruction of the Earth's environment will be more difficult to change. The internal combustion engine and all of the engines and furnaces which burn fossil fuels are now putting a quantity of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that threaten the climate balance of the Earth. And we must now create a new partnership on a global basis to dramatically accelerate the creation of new technologies which can allow and foster economic progress without environmental destruction. Let us listen to those in developing countries who express concern about the terms of technology transfer and who fear economic exploitation. But those from developing countries should also listen to those in the industrial world who say the fruits of invention must be safeguarded sufficiently to reward those who come up with the new inventions so as to encourage the flood of new discoveries upon which all humankind must rely if we are to make this transition. I believe it is possible for us to address this second cause. The third and final cause of this transformed relationship after population and technology is the most subtle, but the most important. It is our way of thinking about the relationship itself. Specifically, it is our assumption that we are somehow separate from nature, that we have the right to exploit nature without any concern for the consequences of what we do. The assumption that we who are alive today at this extraordinary moment somehow have the right to exploit the earth without even considering those who will come after us in the next generation or the seventh generation after that. That way of thinking, which has led to such horrendous exploitation, must now change. But in order to change it, we must continue this dialogue between parliamentarians and spiritual leaders, and between the peoples of every nation, between the peoples of industrial cultures and traditional cultures, drawing upon the wisdom that has been passed down from mother to daughter and from father to son over the thousands of generations for which our species has been on this earth. And we must resist the temptation to believe that the only thing which matters is the world of thought. we must come to an understanding of our basic connection with the rest of nature, with each other, and with those who will come after us. I believe that in parliaments and congresses all over the world, we will soon be coming face to face with the realization that in politics and government, this task of saving the Earth's environment is now the central organizing principle in the post-Cold War world. I believe we are close to a time when all of humankind will envision a global agenda that encompasses a kind of global Marshall Plan, if you will, to address the causes of poverty and suffering and environmental destruction all over the earth. In order to reach that day, we must have leadership in this world, and where it does not come from heads of state, it must come from parliaments and congresses who are close to the people and who hear what people, especially children, are telling us in every nation of the earth. And we must gain enough momentum to overcome the two obstacles that lie in our path. The first is the obstacle of denial, which prevents us from recognizing the problem as it truly exists. But even after we break through that barrier and realize the enormity of the challenge before us, we run headlong into the second obstacle, even more formidable than the first. It is called despair. Earlier today, someone asked the Dalai Lama, how do you tell people to have hope in the face of these enormous tragedies unfolding around the world? And all of us have heard a similar question in the nations from which we come. How can we have hope when we see how large these tragedies are and how enormous these challenges have become? We can have hope because we are human beings and because we are part of God's earth. Archbishop Camara never gave up hope when democracy was snuffed out in Brazil. Nelson Mandela never gave up hope when apartheid threatened to destroy South Africa. The men and women of the formerly communist countries never gave up hope when they saw the opportunity to restore freedom in their lands. We have no right to give up hope. We must reach out for freedom. And as parliamentarians, we must understand the concept of sustainable freedom, to put in place the instruments by which freedom is spread to those who are presently powerless in the world. Because as Martin Luther King Jr. said, in my country, whenever freedom is denied to anyone, freedom is threatened for everyone. We are one world. We do have common commitments, and we share a common hope for the future of this earth. And as we gather here for the Earth Summit, let us commit ourselves to one another and to the people all over this world that we represent, that we shall overcome in this great struggle.